Have you ever not known the answer to a really important question? Maybe it was doing a math final. That's a bummer. Maybe it was when your crush finally talked to you and you went speechless. Talk about a missed opportunity. Maybe you just can't decide whether LeBron or MJ is the GOAT. Starting last week, we looked at one of the most controversial questions that culture asks. Can faith and science coexist? Many of us feel stumped by this question. Last week, when we talked about how many of us have grown up thinking we have to choose one or the other because they feel like they're worlds apart, but we also learned that it doesn't really have to be true. Science and faith can exist in the same space. But as important as it is for us to start there, it's just not helpful for us to stay there. Why? Because it's possible that for some of you who grew up in church, the questions that are now being brought up in your science class seem to clash with what you were taught in the church growing up. Or if you're new to church, there's a chance that what you've been learning at church doesn't line up with what you've been taught from your science textbook. Some questions raised by science seem to create a very real problem with some of the important parts of the Christian faith, especially when it comes to some of the stories found in the Bible. If you're not dealing with this right now, at some point, this tension will be raised. And you'll be left wondering what to do with questions like, was the earth really created in 7 days? If there was a worldwide flood, why do some experts seem to say maybe not? Does evolutionary theory prove that God didn't really create everything the way we think? There's no way a guy named Jonah really survived 3 days in the stomach of a large fish, is there? Honestly, we could keep going, which is why maybe this whole topic makes you nervous in the first place. Because there are plenty of stories or topics where the Bible seems to say one thing and science seems to say another. Plus, science is convincing. Science is the reason we have great things like medical advances that help fight life-crushing diseases. So where do we go with our questions? No matter how hard we try to just believe, science seems to propose facts that stand strong against the things we were taught to believe. And let's be honest, some of these facts are difficult to argue with. That's where things get complicated. When we don't have the answers to tough questions, we may begin to question everything we believe. Maybe you've never thought about it that way, but if you have, you may have felt anger over what you learned about science in church and guilt about even asking questions in the first place. But more than that, what most of us feel is just confusion. We wonder, do I have to shut down my brain in order to believe in God? Do I have to ignore everything science says that seems to conflict with what I believe? Do I have to ignore what science proposes even when it seems like there's a lot of evidence to back it? These are big questions. And here's the good news. God doesn't demand that you disengage your mind when you follow him. God never intended for us to ignore science in order to place our faith in him. In fact, last week we said that science proves how God, created everything. Science can actually prove just how incredible God is. Questions are key to building your faith, and this is important to remember as we move forward. God is not afraid of your questions, and he's not surprised by science or what it feels like when science conflicts with the Bible. If you're new to church, this might surprise you. You may have thought being a Christian is just about blindly following a bunch of beliefs or never asking questions. Maybe this has even caused you to not trust in Jesus because you just couldn't make sense of certain unanswered questions. Well, if that's you, then today is good news. Because here's the thing, if being a Christian required us to have all the answers first, we'd all be in trouble. The reality is that there may always be things that we don't have clear answers for, or at the very least, will likely take us years of study to understand. We may never know the full details of the biblical flood. We'll probably never be able to figure out exactly how all of creation was formed. We may never fully understand how Jonah actually lived in the belly of a fish for 3 days. We may spend years learning and still have questions on how creatures have adapted and changed throughout time. But honestly, with enough time and study, we will definitely have answers to many of our questions. But some may remain a mystery, and that's okay, because following Jesus was always about trusting a person, not having all the answers up front. Throughout history, people have questioned plenty of things about God in the Bible, and asking questions didn't mean they didn't have faith. It meant they were learning more about the God behind creation. Science has explained many things that reshape the way we understood stories and accounts passed down by people for thousands of years. For example, have you ever heard of Galileo? He was a famous Italian scientist who lived in the 1500s. Among other things, he invented a telescope that was able to see farther into space, confirming what a few brave scientists had suggested before, that the Earth was not the center of the universe. The only problem? Most Christians, especially the powerful ones, thought this went directly against what Scripture said. Galileo famously said, "I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with senses, reason, and intellect has intended us to forego their use." In other words, God made our brains, and He would want us to use our minds to better understand the world He made, even if it means rethinking old concepts as we learn more. Galileo knew what I want to make sure you know too. Our faith is built on a person, not a view or a single explanation. Learning something new in science doesn't have to discount our faith, because our faith was always in the person controlling the universe, not our understanding of how he did it. The church in the 1500s was afraid of what Galileo discovered because they were counting on the explanations they thought Scripture offered and not counting on the God behind it. So, when science said something different than they had always believed, there was a lot of fear that people's faith would all just fall apart. But the truth is, there will always be aspects of life and creation that challenge our beliefs, but it doesn't have to destroy our faith. In fact, it can grow our faith in a new way. Because even when we don't see the how, we can still be connected to the who behind it. The Apostle Paul wrote something about this very idea. Check it out. "The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in Him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through Him and for Him. He is before all things, and in Him all things hold together." Let's break this down. Paul is saying that Jesus was there at the start of creation. In Jesus, the whole world was created. He was behind it all and in it all. Jesus, a real man who really lived 2,000 years ago, was present before everything. And not only that, He's the one holding all of creation together today. And that's important because we don't normally think of Jesus as being there. We see creation being God's thing and the cross as being Jesus's thing. But Paul is saying Jesus was there at the start. So when we put our confidence and trust in Jesus, in the who, we are trusting Him for the details of creation from the beginning of time that we may never know. No one questions whether Jesus actually lived. One of the most important historians ever, Josephus, was not a Christian himself. He wrote about Jesus and His life. So the question isn't whether He lived or not, but whether we believe He is who He says He is. See, our faith is not built on being able to prove theories about how God created the universe or whether traditional understanding of specific events is completely accurate. Instead, our faith is built on a person who we believe is the God behind all scientific understanding, not just someone we imagine exists, but someone real people saw in real life and wrote it down. And He is someone real people in this room have a real relationship with right now. When we put our trust in Jesus, who is there at creation and is continuing to hold all of creation together today, and we believe that He is at the center of everything, even if we don't have an explanation for how it works, it means that we can keep searching for answers and exploring science without having to abandon or ignore our faith in Jesus. Here's the truth. You can trust someone before you know everything. When you learn something new that doesn't necessarily line up with what you've read or heard in church, it doesn't mean you have to walk away from the person behind the faith you have. It just means you have to get to know Him better. Okay, let me ask you a question. How many of you have been on an airplane? Raise your hands. Keep your hand up if you know the scientific explanation for exactly how an airplane, a 175,000-pound piece of metal, flies. If you don't have your hand raised, does that mean you're never getting on an airplane again? Of course not. The reason you fly even without fully knowing the explanation of how flight works is because your faith isn't in an explanation. It's in the pilot. You trust the pilot knows the science behind flight and the needed answers to get you to your destination. And every time you fly, you're putting your faith in a person, not in whether or not you have an explanation. The same is true when it comes to placing your faith in Jesus. You don't have to know everything in order to trust someone. You are never going to have all the answers to every question raised about what we believe. But that doesn't mean we have to walk away from our faith. Knowing that you may never have explanations to all of your questions doesn't mean that you should stop asking them. Just because you choose to trust Jesus doesn't mean you have to sacrifice your intelligence. In fact, if you don't hear anything else today, I want you to walk away knowing that there are 2 key ideas you should consider as a result of everything we've talked about. 1, you should ask questions. God is okay with your questions. You don't have to turn off your brain in order to be a Christian. Use it. Being a Christian isn't about having all the explanations to everything you wonder about. God is okay with your doubts, okay with your questions, and He's okay with you exploring the science behind how He created everything. God actually created your brain, so He's more than okay with you using it to better understand the rest of His creation. And number 2, you can trust Jesus. Maybe you felt guilty about the doubts or questions you've had about faith due to your understanding of science. You don't have to feel that way anymore. Our faith is built on Jesus, not on having all the explanations. Maybe you've thought that trusting Jesus means that you can't question certain stories in the Bible or certain things you've thought Christians believe. What if that's not the case? Would you give faith a chance if you knew it was more about a person than an explanation? Our faith is built on the fact that Jesus, who really lived, is also the God who created everything. Our faith is in a person, who that person is, and what that person did. So, how does this change the way you think about what it means to be a Christian? My hope is that it helps you build a faith that will last through the questions that science raises. My hope is that when you're confronted with hard questions, you will remain confident in the person of Jesus. You don't have to shy away from hard questions. Instead, you can explore them and still keep your faith intact. Remember, you trust the person who is behind all of creation and holds it all together. That doesn't change, no matter what. And maybe everything we've talked about today sounds good to you, but maybe you still have questions as to why Jesus should be trusted. Well, don't miss next week. We're going to talk about why we can place our faith in the person of Jesus. As you head to groups, think about your answer to this question. What would change if your faith was built on a person rather than having to know everything?